They told me it would be a quiet dinner, a small birthday promise to myself, and the kind of peace I had learned to crave after years of being the family's soft landing. I am 32, and that night I walked into the restaurant on Harbor Street thinking I would be met with candles and a single grudging smile. Instead, I found a scene that had been arranged like a play I had not auditioned for. My sister Naomi sat at the head of the table as if she had been waiting for an audience. My brother Caleb leaned back in his chair with the easy arrogance of a man who believes the world owes him explanation. My mother watched everything like a judge who already knew the verdict. There was no cake, there was no card. There was a thin manila folder pushed toward me with the care of a ceremonial handoff. "You need to decide about the cottage," Naomi said, and she used the nickname from my childhood as if it could flatten me. "Grandma's will says it should be shared. We have expenses. You have to contribute." The cottage. The small clapboard house where summer had been elastic, and my grandmother's laugh had been loud enough to clear storms. I had painted the fence when I was 12. I had fed the dock geese when I was 16. Grandma had looked at me once when she was nearly 90 and said, "You will take care of it because you are the one who loves it most." I had taken that as promise, not condition. When Naomi pushed invoices across the table, the numbers felt invasive. They were written like obligations, like accounts I had already agreed to shoulder in some secret ledger the rest of the family kept. Caleb grinned in a way that felt like a dare and reached for my purse as if currency would prove loyalty. He made a joke of it, the kind of joke meant to humiliate and then be forgiven. I felt all of my defenses tighten, and then finally I spoke. "I am done paying for your choices," I said. The words landed like a weight and settled in the room. Naomi's expression changed from practiced calm to the flicker of surprise that said she had miscalculated. My mother's silence became an accusation. Later that night, when I closed the door of my apartment and sat at the small kitchen table with my coffee gone cold, I opened my laptop and started to look. I checked my accounts and every auto payment I had ever authorized on a sleep-heavy afternoon. There were transfers to a maintenance account I had never heard of, and charges labeled for property repairs that should have been discussed. It was one of those slow accumulating betrayals that only reveal themselves when you decide to stop forgiving in silence. At 2 in the morning, I found myself printing bank statements and making a folder of my own. I felt ridiculous and electric at the same time. For years, I had been labeled the reliable one, the daughter who fixed things and swallowed discomfort because it was easier than the fight. But the sight of my own name attached to expenses I had never approved made a strange, clean anger rise inside me. It was not the loud, theatrical anger of revenge porn in bad movies. It was quieter, more practical. I wanted to document. I wanted to prove. There was a small, bright ache when I thought of Grandma and the way she used to hum when she mended a torn sleeve. She had never taught me to keep my anger hidden. She had taught me to plant bulbs in October and to hold on to the things that mattered. The cottage mattered. My sense of self mattered. So I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I would not give them another quiet payment. I would not be the invisible ledger they expected. By morning, the air around the apartment felt different, like the moment before lightning. My phone started to buzz in a way that made my teeth buzz. With it, missed calls, texts, voicemails. Naomi called first, then Caleb, then my mother. The tone of the messages moved from incredulous to barbed to openly hostile. They accused me of betrayal and selfishness. They sent snippets that read like rehearsed lines: "Families sacrifice. Real adults pay. You always had it easy." Each message was designed to shame me into retreat. Then the school called. Someone had tried to change the emergency contact for my niece Ellie, and the voice on the other end told me calmly that the caller could not answer their verification questions. It was not accidental. That moment shifted the whole thing for me. This was no longer a matter of money. It had become something that threatened a child's safety, even in small procedural ways. The word that kept coming to my mind was coercion. The voice of the officer who answered my frantic questions later that day used the term coercive control. It was clinical, and it fit. When I told my manager at work what was happening, she listened, steady and practical. "Document everything," she said. "Don't engage. Keep your head down until you have counsel." There are different kinds of courage. Some are loud and public. This one was the kind that organizes receipts into piles and labels folders with dates. The anger that had lit in me on Harbor Street had become a methodical, stubborn strategy. I printed the invoices, photographed the mailbox notices, and saved every single text. The quiet that followed those early, frantic messages felt deliberate, like the pause of an animal listening for a signal before it moves. I did not know then whether they would escalate or relent. I only knew I could not go back to being the daughter who paid in silence. The silence after my refusal was the kind that hums with intention. For a day, nothing happened. I thought perhaps they would grope for normalcy, and the world would accept my refusal like an unexpected weather pattern. That was not how it unfolded. On the second morning, a stranger called and left a thinly veiled warning. Make it right. It was unsigned voice flat. For reasons I cannot rationalize, the voice made my skin crawl more than my sister's barbed messages. It meant someone had crossed the threshold from family argument to deliberate intimidation. I went to the police that afternoon and spoke to Detective Harris in a room that smelled like coffee and paperwork. She leafed through the printouts I had made with a slow, careful hand. "This is coercive behavior," she said, repeating the phrase that had felt strange and accurate in the officer's voice. "And now you have attempts to interfere with a minor. That escalates the matter beyond family bargaining. There is a peculiar privacy to being the subject of an investigation. Everything you have once let slip by is turned into evidence and given weight. It is humiliating in a way that sits beside relief. Relief because someone is listening, and humiliating because the details of your family's small betrayals are now bureaucratized into a bindable set of facts." By dusk, my inbox filled with calls from HR at work. Someone had sent an anonymous complaint that I was unstable, unfit for my role. My manager placed a supportive call to me, her voice steady, telling me to forward everything to HR so they could see the truth. It felt like another layer of attack, meant to destabilize me at the place where my paycheck came from, as if the only thing they could not control was my ability to show up at a desk each morning. That night, when I walked into my apartment, the porch light cast long shadows across the hallway. There was a rustle at the back fence that made me pause, then a dull blow at the wood that sounded like someone testing whether I would notice. When I pulled the curtain aside, there was a fresh scrape across the cedar plank. A single word had been carved into the wood with something sharp. Hey. The letters were rough, a kind of primitive demand. It was not a threat so much as a reminder, as if the house itself had become a ledger they expected me to balance with my dignity. I photographed the carving, called the police, and sat on my living room floor with my back against the couch for a long time. Ellie slept in the next room at my request that week. She had been frightened by small things, and it felt safer for her to be near me. I watched her breathe and thought about the calculus that allowed adults to involve a child in their dispute. There is a kind of cruelty in making someone small feel unsafe and then pretending the problem is merely financial. The next morning, there was a package on my stoop. Inside, wrapped in yellowing newspaper, was an old photograph in a cracked frame. It was the cottage in summer, and in the picture, I was 8 hair cropped by a wind that smelled like salt. Across the glass, someone had written in black marker, "You do not deserve this family." The sentence was both claim and assessment. It assumed authority over my belonging in some way only they could justify. When Naomi texted that day calling me hysterical and ungrateful, I did not respond. Words were poor currency for what had been taken from me over the years. Trust, acknowledgement, the assumption of reciprocity that allowed them to take and never give. Instead, I called an attorney whose name was on a list I had scraped together late the night before. Her voice on the phone was brisk and efficient. "We will file for a protective order if there is pattern of intimidation," she said. "And we will look into the accounts showing charges under your name." The legal framework helped translate my shame into action. There was a strange consolation in turning the personal into procedural. It is not that the law is always just. It is that when it starts to point in the direction of truth, it forces people to stand and answer. I felt a new steadiness in my bones, at the thought of handing the messy ledger of my family's behavior to a system that required explanation. That week became a kind of study in management. Manage calls, manage evidence, manage fear, so it does not manage you. I learned how to sleep in the intervals between alerts on my phone. I learned to keep Ellie's favorite blanket folded near the couch and to practice answering the police with calm statements. Ember of revenge glowed faintly when I imagined the day I would read the truth aloud in a courtroom or a hearing. But more than revenge, I desired something harder: recognition. I wanted my name cleared of liabilities they had attached to me. I wanted the world to know that the kindness I had given was not a credit line. The restraining order process felt oddly ceremonial. We filed papers with an assistant who labeled each document with a stamp and a number. My attorney, Miriam, spoke with a directness that felt almost tender. "We will ground each claim in evidence. This is not theater. Bring every text, every invoice, every voicemail." The courthouse smelled of old varnish and fluorescent lights and the hum of other people's problems. People in the waiting room read their phones with the kind of attention reserved for small, long-term anxieties. I sat with my binder and felt the heft of my proof like a talisman. On the morning of the hearing, Naomi and Caleb sat across from me with the arrogance of people who still believed narrative could outweigh paper. My mother hovered with a look that was more sorrow than judgment, or perhaps a sorrow that had long ago folded into its own defenses. When the magistrate asked questions, Miriam spoke slowly and carefully, pointing to dates and numbers, to the carved word on the fence, to the call to Ellie's school, and the anonymous warning that said, "Make it right." The magistrate's face folded into a map of lines as she read, and then she looked up at Naomi and Caleb and asked whether they had proof for their claims, that I had abandoned family obligations. Naomi spoke first, voice taut. "We had to step in. We managed the property because she was absent." Her words were tight with justification. Caleb snarled that I had been irresponsible. They cast themselves always as the injured party. But when asked for evidence, their hands were emptier than the invoices they had pushed over a restaurant table. Paper cannot be conjured at will in a courtroom. Paper is a stubborn witness. The judge issued a temporary protection order that afternoon and set a hearing for a full order in a matter of days. The ruling was not triumphal. It was administrative and sober, and it felt to me like the world finally acknowledging a wrong. My relief was tempered by the awareness that legal restraint does not cure a family or shift a mother's decades of selective blindness. It does, however, make another set of consequences possible. It puts actions on record, and those records can be used by investigators who take names and dates seriously. After the hearing, there was a quiet that was less about peace and more about the attentive silence that follows a storm where the cleanup crew measures damage. My phone had fewer messages for a while, as if the absence of contact had become a shadow they preferred to avoid. Detective Harris called to say that the financial investigator had opened inquiries into several accounts connected to the cottage, and that my name had been used as a guarantor on paperwork I had never signed. The word fraud hung in the air like an accusation and a promise. That night, Ellie asked as she braided the doll's hair if we could go to the cottage when everything was done. Her voice was small and precise. I felt the old tug toward the place my grandmother had made whole with biscuits and stubbornness. I promised her we would visit when it was safe, and when my name was no longer something someone could use to bind debt. For the first time since that dinner at Harbor Street, I slept without dreams full of clattering invoices or faceless threats. The binder sat on the kitchen counter, a quiet monument to the fact that I had finally traded silence for something I could hold up and show. It was not vengeance in the cinematic sense. It was the patient work of untangling a history of exploitation and making sure the ledger reflected truth. If the last year had taught me anything, it was that revenge without justice leaves you full of bile. Justice without cruelty leaves room for the life you want to build. If you want me to continue with the next 3 chapters in the same pattern, I will write chapters 4 through 6 with the same first-person confessional voice, each chapter again at roughly 900 words, continuing Emma's journey through investigation, family fallout, legal proceedings, and the slow rebuilding that leads toward a reckoning. The courthouse smelled like old varnish and heated arguments. I had imagined before that day the sensation of standing up and speaking my truth would be cinematic, triumphant music, raised heads, vindication in the faces of those who had ignored me. Instead, the room was fluorescent and ordinary, and the sound that cut through everything was the rustle of paper. My lawyer Miriam had a way of flattening hysteria into chronology. She placed the binder on the table like a kind of map and began to point to dates as if she were reading coordinates that would lead us out of the maze. You can see here, she said, the transfers labeled maintenance. The account opened under Ms. Harper's name without authorization, the calls to the school on this date, and the note photographed on her porch on that day. The magistrate flipped through pages and frowned, not in theatrical disbelief, but in the slow, judicial way of someone who weighs the balance of proof like a scale. Naomi and Caleb responded with a predictable mixture of indignation and thin defensiveness. Naomi's face had the tight masking of someone who learned to believe performance could substitute for truth. She spoke as if the family had been burdened by my absence and that I had been willfully blind. Caleb roared his version of events louder than the room required, as if volume could fill gaps in evidence. My mother sat behind them like a weathered photograph, her expression a complicated map of regret, allegiance, and denial. Her lips moved around a prayer I could not decipher. When the magistrate asked me to speak, my mouth was dry. I had practiced in the bathroom mirror at home and on the drive over, but practice is a private thing, and the court felt public in the way that matters are when they are put on record. I told the truth the way I had arranged it in the binder. I read dates aloud. I described the carved word on the fence. I recounted the anonymous text that had said, "Make it right," and the package with the old photograph and the marker shorthand, accusing me of not deserving the family. I did not scream. I did not cry. I tried to be precise. The magistrate granted a temporary protective order and scheduled a full hearing within days. It was not a dramatic victory. It was a procedural one that came with a clipboard and a list of do's and don'ts. But the sign that the law had put its finger on the scale felt heavy and right. For the first time in years, some external authority had documented the imbalance I had been living under. The word coercion stopped being a vague, shameful feeling and became a defined, actionable pattern. Outside the court, the air was early spring cold with a promise of thaw. My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues who offered quiet support and from friends who chose language carefully, almost as if they were afraid of the sound of my relief. Miriam squeezed my shoulder. "This is only the beginning," she said. "They will push back. Expect it. Prepare for it." They did not disappoint. In the days after the hearing, an envelope arrived at my office with copies of invoices and receipts that had been altered, names crossed out, my signature, forged to make a different story look like truth. The forensic accountant Miriam had suggested could already trace digital fingerprints in ways I had not known existed. It turned out paper lies were more fragile than the living performative ones. The investigator called to say they had found a trail leading to accounts Lydia Harper, Naomi Caleb, and my mother had used, accounts that traced back through a shadow of transfers and adjustments that began to make sense when you followed the money. Yet money is only one axis of power. The other was the slow erosion of trust. My mother spoke to neighbors with a version of events that cast me as distant and ungrateful, which she believed without evidence, because belief is a lazy currency. The neighbors looked at me differently, with curiosity, with the kind of speculation that likes to gossip loudly about people it does not know well. My workplace had to file statements. HR asked me to refrain from social media that might inflame matters. I complied because the ledger of my life had to be admissible, and because fury, when it is weaponized against you, is easily misquoted. At home, Ellie continued to hold to the small rituals that felt like conversation without accusation. She would leave a glass of water on the nightstand for her doll and ask me about small things. What is a tide pool? Why did Grandma like to plant bulbs in October? Her questions were anchors. They pulled me back from the chasm of what the family might say and into the immediate, nourishing world I wanted to build with her. The law could not give me a cottage, or change the fact that my mother's loyalties had shifted like weather. But it offered something I had not expected: the time to reconstruct the edges of my life without constant sabotage. Evenings became a pattern: cook, a simple dinner check, the binder, write down new dates, reply to Miriam's emails. I started to notice what had withered in me, a career I had quietly deferred in favor of someone else's peace. I enrolled in a certification course at night, the kind that promised me a promotion and a different ledger of worth. There was an odd, inexorable pleasure in learning jargon that used to sound alien, in watching my name in my professional emails align with someone who held expectations for herself. The case moved forward like a glacier, slow, inevitable, reshaping what lay in its path without a song. Investigators interviewed Naomi and Caleb, and the pattern grew clearer, as if a wall of fog were lifting. They had used my name as a shield, leveraging my quietness into a mortgage of obligation. The thought of it made my jaw ache, not from the money, but from the implication that people I loved had thought so little of me that they assumed I would not notice that my acquiescence was inexhaustible. Through all of it, I practiced being boringly consistent, turning in documents on time, returning calls, showing up. The small acts added up to a kind of moral scaffolding. The law is not poetry, but it is methodical. It translates human cruelty into records that can be examined, and if necessary, corrected. That gave me a strange kind of hope, the quiet belief that even if the family never apologized, the ledger could be set straight. When the investigators called to say they had traced several suspicious loans back to accounts opened with my name, something in me felt unspool and then reknit. It was an odd sensation: grief for the naivety I had carried, and relief that my name was no longer being used as a ledger they could write on and erase at will. Prosecutors took an interest, and for the first time the idea of consequences shifted from a wish into a possible reality. The word fraud, used in the investigator's voice, landed like a door closing on a long, intrusive argument. My mother's reaction was a complicated thing. She alternated between pleading and an odd kind of rhetorical confusion, as if she could not reconcile the person she raised with the person who now sat across from a prosecutor's file. Sometimes she would call and ask soft, almost pleading questions. "Are you sure? Is there nothing we can do?" Other times, she would refuse to pick up the phone entirely, retreating into a silence that felt performative rather than reflective. I did not blame her entirely. Loyalty is a fortress that can shelter people from recognizing their own complicity. Naomi and Caleb began to fray. Naomi's social circle contracted. Gossip in our small town moved along the old lines of inheritance and scandal, and instead of the triumph she had expected, she found hands that refused to clap. Caleb, who had always wielded anger like a blunt instrument, became quieter in the way of people who have been told their power is conditional. There was no joy in watching them shrink. The satisfaction I felt was practical: in quiet papers, filed questions asked the slow alignment of truth. At home, I made a small shrine of ordinary things. A photograph of me at the cottage when I was 8, a pair of gardening gloves my grandmother had left me, a small jar of shells collected from the shore. It was not an altar for revenge, but a collection of evidence for my own life proof that I had roots not measured by the deeds others had tried to forge in my name. Ellie would sit with me and listen as I read aloud from an old cookbook Grandma had kept. Her hair smelled like crayons. She was, in a practical sense, the purest reason for my resistance. She deserved a life not shadowed by adults' manipulations. Miriam advised patience with the prosecutors. "They move in a different rhythm," she said. "But they do move. Keep the binder current. Keep the logs. If you are called, answer with facts." It felt bureaucratic, but sensible. I found an odd steadiness in the routine: collect, label, submit. The ritual made me feel less like a betrayed child and more like someone who had returned to claim what was mine. One afternoon, a neighbor knocked on my door. Mrs. Trent had lived 2 houses down for decades and had seen the family from a distance that gave her perspective. She placed a plate of cookies in my hands and said in a low voice, "You did the brave thing, dear." The word brave felt clumsy applied to the act of refusing to be exploited, but her kindness warmed me in a way paperwork never could. There were moments of doubt. Late at night, when the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, I would wonder if I had been unkind in refusing to continue the silent economy my family expected. Had I been harsh? Had I abandoned them? The questions were old and familiar gifts wrapped in guilt. But then I would look at Ellie asleep in the next room, or flip through a clean page in my binder, and remember that my silence had been the currency they spent. Reclaiming my voice was not a betrayal. It was a reclaiming of oxygen. As the investigation unfolded, small community supports emerged. A coworker offering to take Ellie to school one morning, Miriam arranging for additional security when threats ticked up. Each practical thing felt like a stitch in a new fabric. There was no cinematic payback, no grand confrontation that resolved decades of neglect in a single scene. Instead, there was a slow civil correction accounts, re-examined signatures, tested explanations demanded. We scheduled a hearing where the full scope of the alleged financial manipulation would be read into the record. Sitting in that courtroom, I felt a different sensation than the first time, less raw, more steady. I was no longer simply a person who had been hurt. I was a witness with documents and dates, and an assembled truth that did not need to be theatrical to be persuasive. The prosecutors spoke with a kind of quiet precision which felt like a second defense, less dramatic, more medical, in a way that severed emotion from evidence and let consequences follow. When the hearing adjourned for the day, I walked out into the light and felt wind on my face like a kind of benediction. There was a long road ahead. There were still hearings and interrogations, and no guarantee about how people would be judged by a court. But the ledger had shifted. The narrative that had been written about me in the margins was now being read aloud in the center, and that made all the difference. I went home and planted bulbs in the garden, because Grandma had always said bulbs are a promise you give to the future. Healing did not greet me like a sunrise. It came in thin, almost invisible increments, the way winter loosens its grip one quiet afternoon at a time. In the weeks following the hearing, the investigators' work deepened. There were interviews, subpoenas, quiet confirmations that pieces of my long suspicion were accurate. Each time Miriam called to update me, her tone carried steady reassurance but also caution. Truth moves slowly, she reminded me. But it does move. I clung to that idea when everything else felt fragile. At home, I began to make space for things I had long denied myself. I took evening walks through the neighborhood, letting the cold air settle my thoughts. I cooked recipes from my grandmother's stained cookbook. I reread old journal entries and was startled by how often I had framed exhaustion as responsibility. But what surprised me more was how much quieter my mind became each time I reclaimed a piece of myself that had been ceded to obligation. It was not dramatic, but it was real. Ellie adapted with the resilience only children possess. Some nights she asked me whether her mother would still be angry at me. Other nights she asked nothing at all and simply curled beside me with a book. Her presence steadied me, anchoring me in the simple truth that whatever pain my family carried, she deserved an adult who would not fracture beneath it. I promised myself I would be that adult, even if it meant letting go of people whose love had always come with conditions. One Saturday morning, I drove to the cottage alone. It felt like a final exam I'd postponed for years. The driveway was overgrown but familiar. The door stuck the way it always had. Inside, dust lay in a thin, respectful layer over everything. The old sofa sagged. The wooden floors creaked. And yet the house still held a kind of sacred stillness. I walked to the back porch and faced the vast stretch of water. The breeze lifted my hair the same way it had when I was 8. I felt both grief and gratitude, grief for the family who had claimed ownership of my memories, gratitude for the clarity that they no longer controlled what those memories meant. Standing there, I whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." Saying it aloud made something loosen in my chest. It was as if the house itself acknowledged the truth the way an old friend might nod quietly. Leaving the cottage that day, I realized I was done being the invisible glue of a family determined to stay broken. Some structures are not worth repairing. Some fractures teach you more than mending ever could. When I got home, Ellie bounded into my arms, smelling of crayons and shampoo. Did it feel scary, she asked. No, I said honestly. It felt like remembering who I was. And that night, for the first time in months, I slept through, without dreaming of doors I couldn't open. Spring deepened, and with it came formal charges. Fraud, identity misuse, unauthorized financial activity. Words so clinical and neat they barely contained the messy, painful reality behind them. When Miriam called to confirm the prosecutor's decision, I sat in silence for nearly a full minute. Not because I wanted punishment, but because the confirmation that I had not imagined the harm settled over me like warm water. Validation can feel like vindication, but it can also feel like mourning. My mother reacted first. I learned she had driven to Naomi's house in tears, convincing herself and anyone who would listen that it was all a misunderstanding. She called me that evening, her voice trembling in that old familiar way she used when reality tested her loyalty. Emma, she whispered, please reconsider. They're terrified. So was I said softly. For years, my mother's silence was raw and heavy. She wanted me to absolve them with the old efficiency to soothe their fear with my compliance. But I no longer lived curled into the corners of their comfort. I hung up feeling both guilty and oddly free. Naomi and Caleb responded with their usual divide in tactics. Naomi sent long, spiraling messages about family bonds and betrayal. Caleb sent threats thinly veiled, as warnings court will expose you. You won't win. We're not the villains you think. Their inability to accept accountability was predictable but no less exhausting. The prosecutor's office arranged a meeting where I had to walk through my evidence again with a cold, methodical precision. Each document had to be placed in context, explained like a chapter in a book I wished I had never written. And yet, as I spoke, I felt something surprising steadiness, confidence drawn from the distance between who I had been and who I was becoming. At work, my supervisor, Olivia, called me into her office and closed the door gently. You're handling this better than most, which she said. If you need time, you'll have it. Her support landed softly the way kindness often does when you're used to the sharper edges of responsibility. Nights were calmer now. I no longer startled at every sound. I no longer scanned the street for unfamiliar cars. Instead, I began making plans: a garden in the backyard, a weekend trip with Ellie once school let out a new professional certification that felt like a long overdue investment in myself. Small plans, but they mattered. One evening, Ellie asked me, when everything is finished, will we be a different family? Her question was childlike and profound. Yes, I said gently, but different can mean better. She nodded in a thoughtful way that made her seem older than her years. I hope it means safer. I pulled her close. It will. And for the first time, I believed it. The final hearing was scheduled for early June in a courtroom that overlooked the river with a kind of indifferent beauty. Miriam prepared me the day before, walking me through expected questions, anticipated defenses, and the emotional terrain of facing people who believe their pain excuses their harm. The morning of the hearing, I dressed in a navy blouse and pressed slacks, clothing that felt both adult and honest. Ellie hugged me tightly before leaving for school. Be brave, she whispered, as if bravery were a thing she could gift me. In the courtroom, Naomi and Caleb looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in presence. They wore expressions crafted to evoke sympathy, but the heavy stack of evidence on the prosecutor's table made their performance feel thin. The judge listened to testimony with the same patient neutrality as before, asking careful questions that forced my siblings to confront inconsistencies. Naomi's polished composure cracked when she was asked why my signature appeared on documents filed on days I had been out of state. Caleb grew defensive when confronted with bank transfers traced to his own accounts. My mother sat behind them, hands clasped, eyes glistening with a grief she still could not name, the pain of watching truth expose what love had helped her ignore. When it was my turn to speak, I felt neither rage nor fear, only clarity. I spoke about the years of being the peacekeeper, the quiet contributor, the one who absorbed blame to avoid conflict. I spoke of the carved word on my fence, the package on my porch, the forged signatures, and the attempt to interfere with Ellie's safety. I am not here for revenge, I said slowly. I am here because silence became harmful, and because choosing myself should never have been punishment. The room held its breath. Even the prosecutor glanced at me with something like respect. The judge took her time before delivering her ruling. Her voice was steady when she finally spoke. The evidence supported prosecution. The protective order would remain. Restitution would be pursued, and further investigation into property fraud would continue. It was not the dramatic closure I had once imagined. It was better. It was exact, grounded, irrefutable. As we left the courtroom, Miriam touched my arm. "You stood firm," she said. "That matters." Outside, the air smelled faintly of river moss and sun-warmed metal. I inhaled deeply, letting the weight of the day fall from my shoulders. Something inside me shifted, not an ending, not even a beginning, but a steady step forward. When I picked up Ellie from school, she looked at my face and smiled. "You did it," she said, as if she had known all along. And maybe she had. Because sometimes children see the truth long before the adults around them are ready to speak it. The weeks after the final hearing felt strangely suspended, as if time itself hesitated before deciding what to do with me. Everything in my life kept moving: work deadlines, Ellie's school projects, the slow greening of summer. But inside, I felt a quiet emptiness that I didn't know how to categorize. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was more like the silence left behind after a long, echoing storm. You expect another crash of thunder, but the sky stays still. For years, conflict had been the steady hum beneath my days, anticipating the next demand, the next guilt-laced request, the next crisis Naomi or Caleb would thrust into my hands. That had been my muscle memory. Now, in their absence, my body felt almost weightless, as if it were waiting for a burden that no longer belonged to me. One warm afternoon, I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea, listening to birds chatter in the oak tree above. Ellie played on the lawn, spinning in circles until she fell into the grass with a delighted squeal. Watching her, I realized something shocking. I felt peaceful. Not temporary peace, the kind you buy with compliance, but the kind that comes from knowing the worst has already been named and cannot trap you anymore. Still, loose threads remained. I had not heard from my mother since the hearing. I knew silence was her way of grieving, or perhaps her way of pretending nothing was her fault. For decades, she had built her identity around the idea that harmony was sacred and that any disruption to it was a personal failure. Admitting she had been complicit actively or passively would require her to confront a truth she had long avoided. One evening she called. I hesitated, then answered. "Emma," she whispered, as if my name were something fragile. "I don't know how to speak to you anymore." For a moment, I didn't respond. The ache in her voice was familiar, but it no longer hooked into me the way it once had. "You could start," I said gently, by acknowledging what happened. She inhaled sharply, the way she always did before retreating into denial. "I just want my family back." I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the porch post. "I want a family too," I said, "but not the version we had. That version hurt all of us." She didn't argue. That frightened me more than shouting would have. Silence from my mother meant she was finally wrestling with the truth, and truth had never sat comfortably in her hands. After we hung up, Ellie climbed into my lap. "Are you okay?" she asked, her small fingers curling around mine. "I think so," I murmured. "I'm learning." Ellie nodded in that wise, beyond her years way she had. "Learning is good. Grandma will learn too, maybe slowly." That night, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit. Healing wasn't just for me. The people who had harmed me would have to face their own unraveling, their own consequences, their own shame. I couldn't force it, couldn't accelerate it, couldn't soothe it, but I also didn't have to carry it. That was freedom. The next day, I met with Miriam and the investigators for a final review before restitution proceedings. They laid out a timeline: interviews, financial audits, legal recommendations. It sounded clinical, almost boring, but boring was a sensation I hadn't felt in a long time. And in that moment, it tasted like mercy. When I walked out of the office into the late afternoon light, I realized something simple: my life was no longer organized around survival. It could now be organized around possibility, and I intended to make use of that. Summer settled over the town like a warm, forgiving blanket. The river shimmered with the kind of brightness that made everything look softer, even the old courthouse where so many hard truths had been spoken. Day by day, I built routines that felt like scaffolding for a life I was finally allowed to claim. Early morning walks, lunch in the park, whispered bedtime stories for Ellie. One Saturday morning with Ellie at a friend's birthday party, I drove to a nearby farmer's market. I wandered past stalls filled with strawberries, homemade candles, hand-woven baskets, and for the first time in months, my attention wasn't split between vigilance and exhaustion. I bought fresh herbs, a loaf of warm bread, and a small ceramic mug painted with a blue tide pool design. The artist, a kind-faced woman with silver-streaked hair, said it looks like a beginning. I held the mug in my hands and felt something swell in my chest, something like recognition. Yes, I said softly. I think it is. As I walked back to my car, I noticed a missed call from an unknown number. My stomach tightened for a moment, a reflex I hadn't yet unlearned. But when I listened to the voicemail, the tension eased. It was the financial investigator confirming that restitution would be substantial. You will not be left holding their debt, she said. You have been heard. You have been heard. I sat in my car for a long moment, letting those words sink deep. For so long, I had been the family's unnoticed laborer, the one whose worth was measured by how quietly I sacrificed. Now people who didn't even know me had given weight to my voice. It was as if the world had tilted slightly toward justice, and for once I was standing in the center of it. That afternoon, I drove Ellie to the cottage again. This time, I allowed her to explore every corner, watching as she opened drawers, tapped the wooden walls, and peered through the old windows. She ran her fingers across a faded quilt and whispered, "Did Grandma really sew this?" "Yes," I said, kneeling beside her. "She made it the summer before I turned 12. Ellie traced the stitching carefully. "It feels like a hug." I smiled. That's exactly how she wanted it to feel. We sat on the dock for nearly an hour, feet dangling above water warm enough to hint at July. Ellie threw pebbles into the lake, each splash a small punctuation mark in the silence between us. "Will we keep this place?" she asked finally. I watched the ripples spread then fade. "Maybe not," I said, "but the memories stay with us, even if the house doesn't." Ellie rested her head on my arm. "Then we already have what matters." Her words were simple, but they reached into me like light entering a room long closed. When we drove home, I felt lighter. Not healed, not entirely, but whole enough to imagine what life could look like without fear as its foundation. That evening, I cooked dinner with the herbs I'd bought at the market. Their scent filled the kitchen, warm and earthy, grounding me in the present. Ellie helped set the table, humming softly. Everything felt small, ordinary, and profoundly right. Later, after tucking Ellie into bed, I stepped onto the porch. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. The night air smelled like lilacs and possibility. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next crisis. I was simply living. Restitution hearings are not glamorous. There are no dramatic speeches, no slammed gavels, no satisfying gasps from spectators. Instead, they unfold like slow arithmetic assets, tallied signatures, validated accounts, corrected. Yet sitting in that quiet administrative courtroom, I felt more seen than I ever had in any family gathering. Naomi and Caleb arrived looking frayed, both of them diminished in ways I had never expected to witness. Their expensive clothes didn't mask the fear thrumming beneath their polished surfaces. Losing money is one thing. Losing control is another entirely. My mother sat behind them wearing an expression that seemed carved from equal parts pride and sorrow. She looked at me once, just once, and I held her gaze. There was no anger in me anymore, no desire to shame her. Only a wish that she might one day understand the difference between family loyalty and family harm. The judge listened as investigators presented evidence: forged signatures, unauthorized loans, falsified maintenance reports. Each document was a small, unyielding truth, each truth a nail in the coffin of the narrative they had built around my supposed irresponsibility. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice steady. "I did not come here to punish them," I said. "I came here because clarity matters, because children need safe adults, because love without accountability turns into entitlement." The judge nodded almost imperceptibly. Naomi tried to interrupt at one point, insisting she had acted out of fear, that she believed I would abandon the family if she didn't take control. But her voice cracked thin around the edges. Caleb remained mostly silent, jaw tight, as if replaying every action that had led him to this moment. After several hours, the judge announced the ruling restitution, approved financial oversight mandated, and a formal recommendation for criminal review of the forged documents. It was not vengeance, it was consequence. Outside the courthouse, the wind swept down from the river with a cool sharpness that made me pull my jacket tighter. Miriam smiled a rare, glowing smile. "You did what most people never find the courage to do," she said. "You broke a generational pattern." I wasn't sure I deserved the compliment, but the warmth of it settled over me anyway. That evening, Ellie and I baked cinnamon cookies. She wore an apron 3 sizes too big, and flour dusted her hair like early snow. As we sat on the floor waiting for the oven timer to ring, she rested her head against my shoulder. "When will everything be normal again?" she asked. I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "Normal doesn't always mean good," I said. "But we're building something better than normal." She smiled sleepily. "Something safe." "Yes," I whispered, "something safe." And as the oven beeped and the house filled with warm sweetness, I realized this was my turning point. Not the courtroom victory, not the legal validation, but this quiet evening baking cookies with a child who trusted me completely. A life rebuilt is not defined by the battles won, but by the peace you allow back in. The summer waned slowly, like a curtain lowering at the end of a long play. The air grew warmer, almost heavy, the sunlight lingering on my porch steps long after dinner. In those quiet evenings, I began to understand something in my bones. Peace is not a reward. It is a choice, a series of small deliberate acts that reclaim the self you were taught to bury. The restitution ruling had put distance between me and the chaos, but it had not erased the memories of how easily love can be weaponized by those who believe they are owed your silence. Some mornings I woke expecting my phone to buzz with another crisis. Other mornings I felt a strange tenderness for the girl I had been before all this, the one who believed keeping the family whole was worth any sacrifice. Life, however, kept moving. Ellie thrived. Her teacher sent notes praising her resilience, her kindness, her newfound confidence. At night, she slept without the fear-shadowed heaviness I had seen earlier in the year. She laughed more freely, the sound bright and unburdened. Watching her, I realized that the safest adults in a child's life are not the ones who pretend everything is fine. They are the ones who tell the truth gently and consistently. One evening in late July, my mother knocked on my door. I hesitated before opening it, bracing myself for pleading or accusation. Instead, she stood on the steps looking smaller than I had ever seen her. Her shoulders slumped, her hands fidgeted with the corner of a tissue. Her eyes carried exhaustion deeper than wrinkles or age. "Emma," she said quietly, "I would like to talk if you'll let me." I stepped aside, nodding slowly. She walked in as if entering a room she no longer recognized. Ellie peeked from the hallway, then slipped away with the instinctive sensitivity she possessed. My mother sat at the table, staring at her hands. "I have been thinking about everything," she began. "The hearings, the evidence, your testimony. I realized I spent so many years trying to keep peace that I ignored which part of the family was actually breaking. I didn't speak. I wanted her to continue without being rescued from discomfort." Her voice trembled. "I taught you to be quiet because I thought quiet made things safe. I was wrong. It made you vulnerable and it made them entitled. I didn't protect you, and I am sorry." Hearing the apology, the first one of my adult life, was like feeling the earth shift under gentle hands. My chest tightened with something complicated: relief, grief, forgiveness, and mourning for all the years we lost to silence. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. "Thank you," I said. "I needed to hear that." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't expect you to fix things," she whispered. "I just want to be part of your life again, on your terms." It wasn't a full repair, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, I had learned, often arrive quietly. As summer edged toward fall, I made decisions that surprised even me. I enrolled in a long-term certification program for crisis management, something I had dreamed of years earlier, but abandoned for the sake of family obligations. My supervisor supported the idea wholeheartedly, promising flexibility. For the first time, I invested time and money into my own future without apologizing for it. I also made one final trip to the cottage. Not to mourn, not to reclaim, but to say goodbye. I walked through each room, touching the faded wallpaper, breathing in the scent of old wood and lake air. In the bedroom, I opened a drawer and found a seashell necklace my grandmother had made from broken fragments, her way of showing me that beauty could be rebuilt. I held it in my palm and whispered I kept the parts of you that mattered. Then I closed the drawer and left the house with a steady heart. A week later, Ellie and I adopted a small terrier mix from the shelter. She named him Finn. He barked at passing butterflies and tried to sleep in my shoes. It was ridiculous, charming chaos, and it made our home feel alive again. On a crisp September evening, Ellie and I sat on the porch watching Finn chase leaves while the sun dipped behind the trees. She leaned her head against my arm. "Does this mean everything is better now?" she asked softly. I wrapped my arm around her. "Not better," I said, "but brighter, and safer, and ours." She nodded as if that answer was enough to build a world on. And in many ways it was. As the sky shifted from orange to deep purple, I felt the contours of my life settle into something solid and true. The battles were behind me, the healing was ongoing, and the future, for the first time, felt like a place I could walk toward without fear. If you are listening to this, if your own family has ever used your silence as currency, if you've ever been told that loving them means losing yourself, hear me now. You are allowed to choose peace. You are allowed to protect your dignity. You are allowed to walk away from what harms you, and you are allowed to rebuild. If my story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Someone else might need your voice the way you may have needed mine. And if you want more stories like this about reclaiming power, finding truth, and breaking generational patterns, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with me for the next chapter. Because healing is a journey and none of us have to walk it alone.